Good morning. I'm Danielle McCray. I'm the chairperson for the Budget and Appropriations Committee as well as the councilwoman for the 2nd District. We're joined today by our Council President, Z. Cohen. Thank you. And also committee members, Councilman Antonio Glover from the 13th District. Excuse me, I apologize. Councilman Paris Gray from the 8th District, as well as other council members, Councilmember Zach Blanchard from the 11th District and Councilwoman Odette Ramos. We also have several representatives from the Mayor's Office and the City Council President's Office, and also our committee staff member, Marguerite Kieran. So on today's agenda, we're going to be going over Legislative Oversight LO 25-0015. That's Agency Briefing City of Baltimore Tax Credits. That's for the purpose of inviting the city's Department of Finance to present and brief the City Council on the recommendations, outcomes, and conclusions resulting from the Tax Credit Task Force. At this time, we're going to go directly into a presentation from Bob Senemy with the Finance Department. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. Bob Senemy, Deputy Director, Finance Department, and so I'll be presenting today an update on the work we've done through the Tax Credit Work Group. I've been leading this group over the past year or so, and I think, as you'll see, we found some very interesting things as we've gone through each of these tax credits, and if there's any questions, of course, please just interrupt and we'll take it from there. So for today, I just wanted to first give a quick background on the history and the mission and the scope of the Tax Credit Work Group. And then what we're going to do is go through 6 findings, kind of 6 themes that have emerged as we've gone through all the credits that will help you understand what we found in terms of flaws with our current program and give you kind of some hints about what we're likely to propose as corrections to those. So first off, just the background. The work group was formed at the mayor's direction in January of 2024. The work group membership includes a variety of people. There's some elected officials on it, city agency heads, and there's some private and public experts as well, and some development folks from the development community as well. Do I need to mute on mine? Okay. Oops. Okay. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. Get that. Okay. That's better. Sorry about that. So the work group membership again includes some elected officials, including Council President and Councilman Bullock is on the committee. City agency heads from the key development agencies, BDC, the Planning Department, HCD, Live Baltimore. There are other public and private experts, and there's also some private development folks, as I mentioned, from the development community. So at this point, we've completed our review of all the tax credit programs, and we're now at the stage where we're beginning to deliberate on a solution that we would like to bring, shortly to the mayor and then to the city council. So, our mission is pretty simple. It's to develop a program, a mix of tax credits that accomplishes 3 things. One is to attract additional investment to Baltimore City. In turn, that should 2, create sustainable growth in our general fund revenues. And we want to do that 3, in a manner that minimizes the city's costs by providing only the subsidy required to make a project feasible. And our scope in the group has been 2 types of tax credits. First are what we would call homeowner protection tax credits. These are credits that are intended to simply just protect or reduce the burden on the residential homeowner. And there's 3 of these that we've reviewed: the homestead tax credit, the targeted homeowners tax credit, and the state homeowners tax credit. And then we've also looked at another set of tax credits that we would call development credits. And the intent of those is simply to just encourage the building of new commercial or residential properties. And there's 5 of those you can see listed: the newly constructed, the high performance, CHAP, enterprise zone, and brownfield. So findings. So what I wanted to share here is 6 findings that have emerged as we've gone through our review of these tax credits. And I should mention too that there is a website on the mayor's homepage. There is a link to the tax credit work group where you can look at the presentations from all of our meetings. We've been meeting since February of 2024. I think we've had 9 or 10 sessions now, and you can see all the presentations with the detail if you have interest in getting into some of the meat of those presentations. But what I'm going to share with you today is just kind of the themes that have emerged out of those sessions. You know, one finding is that the city's, what I would call the sticker price on our tax rate, is just misaligned with other Maryland jurisdictions. And what do we mean by that? There's really 3 factors where we are not doing things similarly to other counties in the state of Maryland. So one is in Baltimore, we have something called the Targeted Homeowners Tax Credit. That reduces the tax rate for residential homeowners effectively from 2.24 to 2.04. Okay, and that program, you might have remembered, that was called the 20 cents by 2020 program. We phased that in over a period of time. So a residential homeowner is paying an effective rate that's lower than the full rate. The issue we found is that people don't really understand that at all. You know, we have Live Baltimore, for example, is one of the representatives on our team, and they talk to a lot of realtors and real estate agents and home buyers and homeowners, and people don't really understand. People see the headline rate of 2.24. They don't really realize that they're actually getting a little bit of a better deal than the full rate. What we found in other jurisdictions is that some municipalities actually just charge a lower rate for different classes of property. So they might charge a residential rate and a commercial rate. They might charge different rates in different districts in their jurisdiction for whatever reason. We as a county, we're treated as a county for taxation purposes. So we are not a municipality per state law. But we could go to the state and ask to charge a different rate of taxation for residential homeowners to kind of really, you know, again, solidify the fact that we have a slightly better rate for that class of property. The second issue we found is with the homestead tax credit. The homestead tax credit caps your the rate at which your taxes can grow in a year on a percentage basis. So we have a homestead cap of 4%. State law allows you to be anywhere from 0 to 10. What we found is that 4% is actually very generous. By having a low cap, that means that any growth in property tax beyond that point does not come back to the city. We're protecting the homeowner. And, you know, that's a good thing. We want to protect the homeowner to a degree, but what we've learned is that most other counties in the state are somewhere between 5 and 10%. There's a lot at 5, there's a lot at 6. There are a few that are at 10%. That means their property tax revenue is growing much more quickly than ours, and they're able to then lower the overall rate for their homeowners. So again, this is a quirk in our system. Our homestead cap was set at 4% decades ago. It wasn't, we don't know what the reasoning was at that point, but what we've noticed that over time, most other jurisdictions have inched their caps up a little bit higher, and that's why they've been able to keep their tax rate lower. The final factor that we found is the way the city treats solid waste costs. So we pay for all of our solid waste costs at DPW out of the general fund. And most other large counties, and that includes Howard County, Anne Arundel, Montgomery, and Prince George's, of kind of the big 6, actually charge a separate trash collection fee to their homeowners. And what that results in is that our tax rate looks a lot higher than those jurisdictions because we're paying for those out of the general fund, which means we have to have a higher property tax levy to account for that. So those 3 factors are correctable. And, you know, what you'll see shortly, you know, in the upcoming months when we get into our 10-year financial plan is that we want to have a plan to kind of correct these misalignments and for us to be able to communicate a lower property tax rate. And what that would look like here is that you'll notice the orange line here is the residential homeowner rate. That's the effective rate that residential homeowners are paying. As you can see, when we implemented the 20 cents by 2020 program, we've gotten our rate down to about 2.05 cents per $100 of assessed value. Our plan, our 10-year plan, will be proposing that we will inch our homestead cap up a little bit higher from 4 to 6%, and that with that change, we would be able to generate nearly enough revenue to get our tax rate under $2 for residential homeowners. We think that's a big deal. You probably heard in the mayor's speech last night, he alluded to this. You know, we think it would be a big deal to kind of get our rate under that $2 threshold. I mean, I've told people there's a reason when you go to the store, you pay $1.99 for bananas rather than $2. Like people just, like we're the only rate that's over $2. If we can get our rate under that threshold, we think that's a big meaningful step to get us closer with our competitors. Then the next step would be if we can implement a solid waste fee where we would charge directly for trash and then take that out of our general fund, which is again what most of the large counties do in Maryland. We could get our residential rate down to about $1.80. Does that get us equal with other jurisdictions in the state? No. We are, for better or worse, for our lifetimes, we are going to have a higher tax rate than our neighbors because our tax base is significantly lower than our neighbors. The average home value in Baltimore City is a third of what it is in a Howard County or Montgomery County. So that's just the high tax rate is partly a function of us having a lower tax base. But these misalignments are things that we can correct, and we think that that could have an impact on at least opening up the option for folks to shop in the city where they might just be tuning us out now because they've heard the perception of that high tax rate. So that's finding number one from the group. Finding number two among homeowner protection tax credits is that we are under-enrolled in something called the state homeowners tax credit. So, and this is costing our homeowners valuable tax relief. And there's two reasons for this. The reason we think we're under-enrolled in this program is, again, twofold. One is that to qualify, by the way, I should say this program, city residents can enroll in it, but it's paid completely by the state of Maryland. So it's in our interest to get as many people as we can, legally, of course, and they're eligible to get them signed up for this program. What's happened here, as you can see on the chart, is we've lost enrollees in this program over the last decade. The requirements for the program are that you have household income less than $60,000. It's on the tax base on your property up to $300,000 of assessed value, and you have to have a net worth of less than $200,000, excluding the property itself. So net worth would include things like investments or pension plans or retirement accounts and things of that sort. When we have looked at the data on this, we've done some analysis on census data, community statistical areas, our property assessment data. We're pretty sure that we're under-enrolled by thousands of people in Baltimore. And the average tax relief for being enrolled in this program is $1,700 per homeowner. I mean, it is significant relief. It takes your rate down significantly. And again, it's geared to help people that are struggling, that have lower household income. But we have not been effective, I would say, entirely effective at getting people enrolled. And again, one of the things you'll see soon in our 10-year plan is we're going to have an initiative where we're going to have to put some heads together and figure out how do we get people enrolled. We've talked about it. We've done press releases. There are some nonprofits in the community that try to get people enrolled, but when you look at the data, it just still looks like there's a lot of people that could get this tax credit and are not getting it. So that would be a combination of us taking the effort to get people enrolled and continue to put the pressure on the state to kind of index that $60,000 cap with inflation. It's been tried many times. There has been a bunch of bills to try to index that. They've always failed because it would be additional cost for the state. But if we enroll additional people, the state just has to pay for it. It's an entitlement. They would have to come up with the money for that program. So that was finding number two for the homeowners protection tax credits. Finding number three out of the six, now we move into the development tax credits. And so what we found is that we don't really have what I would call a but-for test for our largest subsidies. What I mean by a but-for test is that in financial terms, when you're looking at a project, you would run the numbers and figure out, okay, what is the minimal subsidy, like we talked about, that's needed to make a project go? And what we found is that actually we do have a but-for test, but it's kind of backwards how it should be. And the example I would use is for apartment projects. If you build if you're a developer that's building an affordable apartment project where you have rents that are below the 100% of the area median income, you are allowed to ask the city for a pilot agreement. Pilot agreement means that you don't pay the full tax rate, you pay a set payment that's lower than the full tax rate. And we've worked a lot with the council president's office on these over many years. And the requirement for those projects is that has to go to the Board of Estimates for approval. It goes through a committee that includes the mayor's office, the council president's office, law department, real estate, HCD, finance, where we look at the financials and make sure that everything is tight. The developer is required to submit a project pro forma showing their profit and loss over many years. They have to show the rent rolls, the debt service coverage. They show an analysis with and without the pilot, what the project would look like from their perspective. And we get a lot of these. We were averaging about 5 to 10 per year, but lately there's been a lot more. I mean, Dexter's nodding. There's been a lot of these projects. The subsidy amount on these is actually pretty low because, buildings that are providing affordable housing, they tend to have lower assessed values. So when we're giving a subsidy, they average, I've gone back and looked at this, the average subsidy is about $50,000. But that's a very rigorous process to give a subsidy of $50,000 in order to get somebody to build. On the other hand, our market rate apartment projects, those are approved by right, so we don't see them or look at them. Our Fiscal Integrity Office and Finance reviews them just for eligibility. We do not look at the developer's financial analysis and what the profit looks like to them. There's only a handful of these that come through a year, on a good year, 5 or 6. In recent years, we've had some 1 or 2. And these projects, we're providing an enormous subsidy on these. I mean, we're talking about an average of a $500,000 per year subsidy for these projects to get built. We want these projects to be built. Let me be clear, we want those projects to be built. That's tax revenue to the city. But the fact that we're spending so much time on these affordable projects and we have no process to test these larger projects that generate a lot of tax revenue and come with significant subsidies, to me is just backwards. We should be spending more of our time on the projects on the right and a little bit less on the projects on the left. And so we have some ideas about how we would scrutinize that or fix that. Our intent here is not to test every single project, it's just to test the really high value ones. We have some projects that come through that are pretty small, residential renovations. We don't have the time nor the staff nor the inclination to try to look at all those. But when you have a project that comes in where you have an assessed value that's going from 30 million to 200 million plus, we should be looking at that project and make sure that we're providing just the minimum subsidy that's needed to make that project worth it. Finding number 4 is that we tend to have, our tax credit tend to have a one-size-fits-all approach. And what I mean by that is that the credit is the same regardless of where you get it, which neighborhood the project is located in. And we have found some interesting examples from other cities. Example of one is Columbus, Ohio, where they actually split the city into thirds, and they acknowledge that there are different needs for projects in different neighborhoods. So for us, this is using the language of what Columbus did recently. They had a similar group that we're working through, a tax credit group, and they broke their cities into third, and they said, look, these neighborhoods that are persistently disinvested, those neighborhoods need full tax abatement, 100% tax abatement to make the work happen, and probably additional things on top of that, additional private or public investments into the neighborhood. On the contrast, on the far right, we have neighborhoods now that are pretty healthy. And, for those neighborhoods, you could begin graduating those neighborhoods out of that highest level of subsidy. One example I'll use is the CHAP tax credit. It's 100% abatement for 10 years. That applies whether you're building in Fells Point, whether you're building in Canton, or whether you're building in Carrollton Ridge. That doesn't really make sense to me because the former markets that I mentioned are pretty healthy. They still need some subsidy, but they might not need the full subsidy, where some of our other neighborhoods clearly still need the 100% abatement. So, one approach that we might take with our reform is to try to split our city into some categories to help us try to target the incentive amount to what is actually needed for that neighborhood. Our one-size-fits-all approach tends to encourage people to build in neighborhoods that are already doing pretty well, frankly. And when you look at the maps, if you go through the presentations, a lot of the development has happened in those neighborhoods that are doing well. That suggests to me that our program has worked to strengthen those neighborhoods, but we want to take that success and try to move it to that kind of next tier of neighborhoods that we want to lift up and improve those places. The fifth finding, again, a theme across all of our tax credits, is that we just have way too many rules that are either burdensome or inconsistent across programs. There's a lot of blame probably to go around on this. Some of this is probably finance insisted on something. Some of them could have been when we passed these bills years ago, a council member insisted on a rule for something. But when you go back and step back and look at these collectively, there are some kind of weird kind of quirks in these that don't really make much sense. And just some examples of that, eligibility-wise, some of our development tax credits require the dwelling to be owner-occupied after it's built, and others require the filing of a state income tax each year. If these are meant to incent development, we don't necessarily care as much who lives there. We need the properties to be built so that we can kind of grow our population. And so some of those we've re-looked at and thought maybe those requirements don't make as much sense. On the application itself, some of them require two-step approvals that you have to, make a submission before and then after. Other ones, you just have one final application. And again, we couldn't discern going back and looking at it why there were those differences in certain projects. Some tax credits transfer to subsequent owners. So if you have a credit through year 3 and it's a 10-year tax credit and you change ownership, the other owner picks it up from year 4 to 10. Others actually change. Other credits actually lapse after the transfer of the property. And then the credit calculation and the terms are all over the map. Some of our programs use the assessed value to calculate the tax credit. So some of the other ones require a property appraisal, which comes at additional costs for either the city or the owner. And the credit terms range from 5 to 10 years and from 50% all the way to 100%. So there's definitely some inconsistencies. And as we've looked at these over time, we haven't really been able to figure out why they were set up so differently. And I think naturally it's just that they were each set up individually, and so there wasn't a consistency among all the programs. And I would say before going in onto the final finding, I kind of see a world where finding 3, 4, and 5 kind of fit together. Like from a finance perspective, if I had the confidence that I could test the very high value projects, and I had the confidence that we were gearing the subsidies to the right neighborhoods in the right way, I would say, fine, let's get rid of all these kind of extra rules. Let's encourage people to apply and be able to build. But they kind of go together. If you get rid of the rules, but you don't have the kind of comfort of the testing up front, you could be actually having more people get credits where they don't need the subsidy or the full subsidy, and you could end up costing the city additional revenue. So I do think that with findings 3, 4, and 5, in my mind, there's kind of a package emerging of we could have a program where we say, we're gonna add a little bit of a test on these high value ones. We're gonna try to better target them to certain neighborhoods, and we're gonna take the rules away, some of these burdensome rules, so that we encourage more people to apply for them. To me, that would be a program that could accomplish some of the needs that we talked about earlier. So finally, finding number 6, we have found other, what I would call, program-specific quirks in each of these tax credits, and I'll just go through 5 of them real quickly for each of our development tax credits. So the brownfield tax credit first, the state law for that one requires that not only do we provide the tax credit to the property owner, but we also must make a contribution into a state economic development fund. What we've been able to figure out is that we have contributed way more to the state economic development fund than either the city or projects in our jurisdiction have pulled out of it. There's not a requirement that what you put in must come back to the city. It goes into a general state economic development fund, and we've done the research on this. We've actually contributed more. To be in the brownfield program, though, you have to make that contribution. So we have talked in the group about, does it make sense for us to pull out of that, create our own fund, or make other changes to the program that gives us a better deal. But that's something we're considering. The state law also allows us to add optional provisions on the credit length. So the brownfield program is a 5-year, 50% tax credit. We chose in 1997 or 8, I think. I mean, we joined this program decades ago. We chose to add a provision that said if you're in an enterprise zone, it extends the tax credit, and if the cost of the project is more than $250,000, that it extends the tax credit as well. So we now have a 10-year 70% program rather than a 5-year 50, and it's because we opted into these provisions many years ago. We've had conversations about maybe those provisions aren't the right things. For example, the $250,000 threshold, that covers almost every project that's going through some kind of brownfield renovation. So we've talked about maybe we need a higher threshold. Other counties have $1 million threshold as an example. Ours is kind of artificially, we think, low. And so we're trying to think of ways that we can tweak that one so that we still have it out there to allow for the development that's needed for cleanup projects, but make it a little bit more cost effective for the city. The CHAP tax credit I mentioned before, this is our only program that's a full 100% abatement for 10 years. So if you do a CHAP project, you get a full abatement on the value by which that property improves in value. So in other words, if you started with a property that's worth $50,000 and it gets improved to $450,000, that $400,000 increase, you pay no taxes on that new improvement. That's very generous. Most of our other programs are 80%. Some of them are 50%. So CHAP is 100% 10-year abatement for anywhere you build in the city. The other thing we've noticed, again, is that CHAP looks like it's worked in a lot of neighborhoods, but most of the value has gone into what we call typology A and B, using the housing department's typology. the strongest neighborhoods. So again, we think it's maybe time to graduate some of those neighborhoods and then think about how do we get to that next tier of neighborhoods. The one thing I didn't mention here on the slide that is also that the map for the tax credit is kind of wild because it's linked to these historic districts, but we've talked pretty openly in the group about maybe we just need a citywide renovation tax credit that's like the CHAP tax credit, because really CHAP is used to renovate mostly older, row homes. It does get occasionally used for commercial properties, but the vast majority of the CHAP tax credit gets made for those kind of flips, I would call them. And that's, I don't like that term necessarily, but renovations of properties, gutting the inside, making the nicer internal and exterior details. And again, that program I think has worked pretty well in some places, but we've really thrown a lot of the cost into certain neighborhoods and we want to try to expand that. The newly constructed tax credit, this was probably the biggest aha moment for me. When we talked about the newly constructed tax credit, again, this is for building brand new homes from scratch. So the example up there is in the Medfield neighborhood near Hamden. But we had home builders come into our group and we said, what makes you interested in building in Baltimore? And most of them said, this tax credit really doesn't influence their decision to build. What they want is they want land. They want it to be zoned correctly so they can kind of get right to work. And they need the economies of scale that they can need enough properties to make it worth it for them. So they're not going to come and build an 8-unit development or a 20-unit or even a 50-unit. They need enough land that they can build bigger. And frankly, the city doesn't have a lot of available land. But when you think about the places where we've built new buildings, there was a large enough parcel that somebody could come in and they could get the economies of scale about having a model and then expanding it very quickly. If you're only doing 3 or 4 of those or 8 of those or 15, it's just not worth it for the vendor, the home builder, to do that. So that was interesting to me that here the tax credit was less important than some of these other factors that maybe we could use to influence those decisions. The high performance market rate tax credit is the one for apartment buildings. I think the key finding here is that we've built a lot of market rate and above. Some of them we would call luxury units. We've built 50 of those over the past decade or so, which has created almost 7,000 new apartment units in Baltimore, and that's been, I think, successful. We've had a lot of building there. But what we're seeing now is that the demand, some of those luxury units or above market rate units are kind of struggling to fill some of those spots. And the demand is higher in the more middle income areas, the more affordable areas. Our tax credit, though, specifically precludes you from getting this credit if there's any affordable units in the building. So it's called the market rate tax credit because it was geared towards building these very nice buildings, again, market rate and above. Some of them you would consider luxury units. So one thing we've talked about is maybe we need to tweak this credit and again reduce some of those rules and make it a little bit more open so that you can build other types of buildings that have some affordable units in them. And one thing to acknowledge is that the developers on our group have told us very clearly that the activity in this market has slowed, partly just due to higher interest rates and higher construction costs over the last few years. So it's really hard to get one of these projects to work. Even if you're building a market rate and above project, just the financials are not working as well as they did over the past decade when we had low, pre-pandemic, we had lower interest rates, we had lower construction costs. There were a lot of these units were built and they're just not working. The financials just don't work at the moment. And then finally, the last one on program-specific findings is we have the enterprise zone tax credit. This is a state program where we get 50% reimbursement. So somebody makes a commercial improvement within the enterprise zone, and you can see reference on our website. There's a map for the enterprise zone, which basically covers a lot of the industrial areas and commercial districts. If a business makes an improvement to a property there, they get a 80% credit for 5 years, and then it declines to 30% over time. But we get a check from the state that reimburses us for half of that cost. The governor tried to eliminate that in this year's budget. The city and some others were able to fend that off. So that has just kind of made put a reminder in our heads that they're going to be coming for this. I think what the state looks at it and says, if you guys think this credit is so good, you guys pay for it. Why do we have to pay for it? And the fact that they tried to cut it suggests that maybe they don't think it's a great value. And again, they're sending a check to us. It's a literal line item cost in their budget. They had proposed to basically eliminate this program and not create any new ones, which would have phased the program out over a 10-year period. Again, we were able to fend that off, but what it's really forced the group to do is to start thinking about, if we were to lose this program, what would we do for commercial? Because we don't have anything. We'd either have to create our own program or kind of just fly without it and see what happens, and see if we still get that commercial incentive. So BDC was very instrumental in helping us to kind of fend this off. The development community helped as well to kind of fend that off, but that was a kind of an emergency situation, so to speak, in this year's session where we were able to fend that off. But the fact that they went for it this year means it probably will come back, and they might be looking at it as a budget savings in future years. So that's just a really brief summary of the basics and the findings of what we found so far. I can say, just in closing, the work group is moving into the deliberation phase, so it took us longer than we did expect to get through all of the programs because they're very complicated. If you go to our website and look at the presentations, there's a lot of great data and information that our staff put together, which I'm really proud of them for gathering some of this stuff. It's really interesting data. So we took a long time to really dive in and get the information. Now we're moving, starting today, we're actually meeting after this, we're gonna start moving into the deliberation phase. And with the findings that you've seen so far, we already kind of have the framework of like, okay, there are some ways that we can clearly improve these programs. And our goal again would be to come and, present something to the mayor to get his approval. And then we would come with a package of reforms ultimately to the council to change our programs and make them, better targeted and more effective for Baltimore. And I'll say in closing too, I don't think this is a zero-sum game. I think we can have better controls in some areas and reduce rules in other areas where we can have a much more effective program that actually costs the city a little bit less money or actually drives more growth in our tax revenues. And so we tend to think of tax credits as like, oh, it's like the city on one hand and the developer on the other. I think there's enough things we found here that we can do both to make the programs easier to navigate and encourage more building, but also put some common sense controls in to make sure that the city's getting the best value when we're providing these subsidies. So I'll pause there and happy to take any questions, of course, from the committee.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm sure that everyone will echo what I'm going to say here, and that we truly appreciate you presenting this and just outlining these items. We're going to start with questions at this time, and I'm going to start with Council President Cohen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bob, I want to echo what the chair said and thank you for presenting, but I also just want to thank you for taking this on. I think it's hard. You get a bunch of elected officials, developers in the same room, and just getting everybody to try to come to some consensus, I think is a really tough task. And so I appreciate both the fact that you took it on and the fact that you were, I think, really trying to find the sweet spot here. Just want to acknowledge and recognize you for that. So thank you.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
Where I want to start, I would say that right now, Baltimoreans are experiencing just a deluge of fines, fees, taxes, BGE bills, water bills. I think folks are struggling, that there's sort of a breaking point. What I take away from finding number one is that, and I want to frame this carefully, we're not actually providing relief, we are shifting the burden, right? It's going from, it's the lowering the cap on the homestead tax credit, and it's the creation of this solid waste fee. Right. And so while symbolically and aesthetically, I can appreciate what we're doing in getting the property taxes under 2% and the way you framed it in terms of we are not competitive with the surrounding jurisdictions, the burden still falls on the people that live here.
Right.
And so I wanted to just understand that, because to me, it's a little disappointing when we go out and publicly claim we're reducing tax burden, and then what I see is more of moving it around. And so one, kind of the justification for that, and two, where do you think the burden will now fall, right? So if we're shifting away from property tax toward the homestead tax credit and the solid waste fee, can you explain to us where you see that burden moving?
Yeah, so I think that's a fair question. We've gotten that feedback. Are you just rearranging things? So let me start with the getting the rate under $2 that was alluded to, that was talked about in the mayor's speech. And, the way that we'll get part of the way there is we would have to have a higher homestead cap. That combination will provide some relief, some direct relief for our homeowners, for ones that are in properties that are not growing very rapidly in value. By bumping up the cap from 4 to 6%, what we're basically saying is, look, if your property is growing very rapidly in value, we need you to just bear a little bit more of that cost. And so what you're doing is you will have properties that are growing quickly. Some of those people will pay a little bit more with the higher homestead cap, but they'll also get the relief from having the rate down to 199. If you're in a property that's not growing very rapidly, that's actually true relief to you because you don't get the homestead credit today. Only about a third of our residential properties are currently getting the homestead tax credit. So there is some relief in there. And, we'll be honest, it's modest. You're talking $100 to $200 a year. I would say for a lot of people, that's still pretty meaningful. We have, we have done some analysis of like every possibility of homeowner. If you're in a home that is assessed to $200,000 and it grows to $250 in one cycle, or if you're in a home that's $500,000 and it only grows to $505, we've looked at all the different scenarios. And yes, there are some people that will pay a little bit more with a higher homestead, but they'll get the relief as well, which will make it roughly neutral. And there are some homeowners that actually will get direct relief. On the solid waste fee, we have to structure the fee in a way that would make it neutral so that it wouldn't affect individual homeowners, to make it that it's not inequitable. So we still have a lot of work to do to study that. Other jurisdictions have done this, so we have some models to work on. But one of the arguments against it is, well, if I'm somebody who lives in a property that has a high assessed value, I'm going to get a significant amount of tax relief, but I'm only going to pay a $400 or $500 trash fee. So it's going to be better for people at higher value properties. We can correct for that. There's ways to correct for that. We did it in our stormwater utility when we did that based on the size of your property or impervious surface. So if we were to propose that, and that's going to take years of study to get to a right proposal, we would be proposing something that we would want to make sure that residents aren't any worse off. To the point about moving things around and it's the aesthetics, I still think it's very important because let me give you an example. If we were to leave the system as it is today and we were really able to come up with $10 million of savings, that would reduce the full tax rate by only 2 cents. So let's say I get the tax rate from 2.24 to 2.22. We would have to get $10 million of recurring savings. That's hard to get, in a city that has so many needs. To me, if I tell somebody that I'm reducing your full rate from 2.24 to 2.2, even if we did the hard work to develop that, it still gets clouded by the fact that it's still 2.22 compared to, these rates that are so much lower. So I still think that the correcting what you call the aesthetics, what I'm calling the sticker price, is kind of a way to get to a point where now, if we do provide more relief, it's more impactful. If you're doing it in a world where it's colored by the fact that our tax rate is so much higher to start with, and we don't correct those misalignments, people are like, really? You just reduced my rate from 2.24 to 2.22, and that's not helpful. If we correct those couple of misalignments, we can then be talking about a tax rate for a homeowner that's 1.8, $1.80, $1.81, and then you're close enough. Like I said, we're not going to get our tax rate to 1.2.
Sure.
There's no world in our lifetimes where we can get there, frankly. It's just not, we're just too poor compared to the surrounding counties. But at least you put yourself in a neighborhood where a home buyer might say, well, 1.8 is not bad. It's a little bit higher than these other places I'm shopping, but at least it's in the neighborhood. And to me, it's kind of like, why not match what the other jurisdictions are already doing? Usually you should do it because everybody else is doing it is not usually good advice, right? You don't teach your kids that. But in this case, it's like, if they're taking advantage of these higher homestead caps and the solid waste fees, why shouldn't we do the same thing so that we get on a more apples to apples basis with those. So I would say, I mean, my answer to your question is there is a little bit of relief in there for some homeowners, the getting down to 199, depending on how quickly your property is growing in value. And I would just argue that the aesthetics, I think, are important and kind of sets us up, gives us then a platform to try to make additional improvements going forward. But if we don't correct that platform, the relief that we're providing is not going to be very meaningful. And I don't think will help us attract new investment into the city.
No, and I want to be clear, I appreciate the aesthetics. I mean, I think the story we tell to ourselves, to the outside world is important. And I don't discount in any way, shape, or form that our current tax structure looks really bad when someone is considering, should I buy a house here? Should I build here?
Right.
Like, you're right. And I had sort of thought that part of the premise of this working group was more along the lines of, like, are there credits that we are currently giving to stimulate development that may not be necessary, so that we could then transfer that into a general property tax break? Because what I heard a lot from the builder community was essentially like, look, we know there are a ton of different tax credits. And I know this may have changed, the tenor of this may have changed throughout the group, but if we could get property taxes down in a real way, it would level it and make it easier for us to build. And so I'm just curious about that piece, because I understand you on the sticker price and the aesthetics and sort of the importance of telling a story where we're not having disproportionately high property tax compared to folks right across the road from us. But again, to me, I sort of had hoped the premise of this was, could we actually lower the overall burden on ratepayers, taxpayers in the city, in order to create a scenario where it is easier to develop because property taxes are lower, and not have to have, I think you're finding number 3 through 6 or whatever is like, there's a lot of redundancy in the actual credits.
And so I think for those findings 3 through 6, talking about program specific things, we did find some things in there where we think there are savings, or there's areas where we might be over subsidizing. That could lead to additional reduction down the road. The thing we have to keep in mind, though, is if we were to reform those credits, it takes us 10 years to get the full value of those, because if we're approving a tax credit today under the old rules, we're stuck with it for 10 years. So if we reform it, we showed some examples where we said, oh, there's some areas where maybe we're not getting the best deal. If we fix those now, we will have savings later in the 10-year period. And in the 10-year plan, there will be an initiative basically called, development tax credit reform, and the savings grow in the out years. I mean, the development world is complicated enough that, like, you really don't, you're not sure exactly how it's going to play out. I mean, we're trying to use the data we have to make the best decisions about what this program should look like going forward. But the reason we don't want to commit to anything too early is that you kind of have to see how that plays out. My strong suspicion from looking at this is that there are savings, that there's both subsidy savings and that there's ways we can actually attract additional investment. And if we see that play out over time, I think we could consider, in the later part of the plan, we could consider additional tax reduction. So there are ways to do that. Now, will that get the rate down, Council President? Will that get the rate from, like, the full tax rate from 2.24 to 150? No, because even just to get the rate from 2.24 to $2 on the full rate is like $120 million cost, right? And so what we're looking at in these programs is not savings to that degree. I still think we need incentives that make sense, that are strong enough to incent development, because you do sometimes need incentives even for market rate development in Baltimore. But we want to squeeze out the fat or the excess or the places where it's not working, and we could in the later years redirect that to additional relief. My argument would be, while you're doing that, get the sticker price right, because then if you have a chance to actually truly reduce the rate, then you're working from a correct sticker price. And then when you give the relief, people might say, oh, it's actually not as expensive to live there. Now I'm getting real relief. But it's a multi-step process, and I think we have to do all those things concurrently to get to a point where a place where we're more competitive. So that would be my thinking about how to get there over time.
Appreciate that. Just last sort of clarifying question for me, the solid waste fee, and you mentioned not fully baked, not fully developed yet, but just want to understand who would pay for it. Like, is it everybody? Is it renters, homeowners? Like, just help me understand that part of it, because again, what I'm hearing in this is not so much overall relief, but sort of a shifting of burden from one group to the other. No, not a judgment on whether that's a good shift or a bad shift yet. I want to really understand it, but just help me understand that piece of it and sort of why we think that increasing a solid waste fee. I know you mentioned other counties do it, but just who pays for that? Like, if we're taking that out of the property taxes, which Baltimoreans are paying for it?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you structure the rate. We studied this, the original 10-year plan that ran from fiscal 13 to 22. This was in the original 10-year plan that we wanted to do this. We studied it, we took it, and ultimately back then, the administration backed off on, didn't want to focus on it because they wanted to focus on other things within solid waste. But what I saw in that analysis, and we'll have to refresh that analysis, is that, generally, one is that you create kind of a dedicated funding stream for solid waste to start. So you can even bond and borrow off of a solid waste enterprise fund. We do that for our stormwater utility today. Sure. Whereas today, solid waste is competing with every other agency in our general fund to compete for these very scarce capital dollars.
Sure.
So there's a world where which if you can, create the solid waste enterprise fund, have a fee-based structure that pays into it, you can actually borrow money off of the solid waste enterprise, just like we do in our water utility, wastewater utility, and our stormwater utility. So it does create a dedicated stream just for solid waste initiatives. Now, we have to be mindful that the rate stays reasonable, right? We don't want to shift over to a fee and then have the fee growing by 12% or 20% a year. That's not in anybody's interest or the homeowner's interest, but you can do it in a way where you can get some more investments and try to keep the rate reasonable. It generally, what we've seen when we've studied this before is you have to structure it in a way that the less you pay in property tax and the more you pay in fee is within some kind of reasonable range. And so you can structure the fee in a way that it does that. One thing that some other jurisdictions have done, and we haven't talked about this, internally in much detail yet, is other counties sometimes have different sized trash cans where they say, look, you can purchase a smaller can, and if you generate less waste and you recycle more, you pay less. The fear of that is always like, well, are we going to have people that are going to, illegal dumping and all those things? But there are different structures where you charge based on the size of your property a different rate, or based on whether you're consuming a lot of trash or less trash. And so that's the work we have to do to figure out, can we get a rate structure if we're to do this that makes sure that we're not harming anybody, that nobody is really significantly worse off or too much better off, and we do it in a way that's fair. And again, a solid waste fee would be lienable, so it's not like you can avoid it and we're not going to pick up your trash. We're going to pick up your trash, even if you're not paying it. It would be lienable just like property taxes is. So I think some of the misconceptions are around, there's going to be all this illegal dumping, and you're not going to pick up my trash because I didn't pay last week or last month or this year. It wouldn't be like that. It's just like your property tax, you pay it, and then it's lienable. If you don't pay it, it's another thing that kind of plays into our process for collections. So I think, again, it can be structured in a way that you keep people within a range. It's never going to be, I paid $500 property tax and I'm paying $500. It's never going to be perfect, but we want to keep it in a range so that you're really not affecting people dramatically to put that in place.
Got it. Hey, again, just want to thank you for the extraordinary amount of work that went into this.
Thank you, Council President. We're also joined by Council Member Mark Parker from the 4th District. From the 1st District, apologies. Regarding the subsidies, specifically, and I'll go to find in number 3, the market rate apartment project subsidies. What other barriers outside of additional staffing is holding us up from testing these projects similar to how we test the affordable apartment projects?
The only barrier right now is the legislation. We'd have to change it to require some kind of test for certain projects because the tax credits are written into the city code. The pilot projects that I'm referring to here go through a separate process because the state code allows developers for certain type of projects, for either affordable housing development or for economic development, allows developers to ask for a pilot. So that's the reason those particular pilots go through that process with all the controls. And the controls that are in place there are things that we've put in place over years, having a pilot committee. You know, Dexter sits on this on behalf of the president. You know, HCD, law, finance, there's participants. We've put that in place to make sure that when we look at those, we scrutinize them. The issue on the other side, on the market rate, is that there's just no control. There's nothing in legislation that requires us to do this. So our thought would be that we could come with a package that would say, you know, for certain projects over a certain amount, you know, that we would have this test. Our review process, I mean, we can usually look at the financials on one of these complicated affordable projects. We can usually look at it, analyze it, and approve it within a week. I mean, I do it for finance. I'm the one who reviews all of them. I look at it, I ask for the financials. I do the test of what does it look like with and without, and then, you know, we ask some questions. Council President, Comptroller's Office adds some expertise on the real estate side to say, wait, did you think about this or that element? But usually we can sort that out very quickly and say, okay, this is subsidies needed to make this project go, and then on it goes, it passes the board. We don't do that at all for our market rate projects. And so again, my perspective is there's probably some loss in there, kind of what we're talking about. There's probably some projects that needed a subsidy, but maybe didn't need the subsidy that we gave them because it's fixed in law, and some of them haven't changed in decades, the amounts we're providing. And the market changes pretty dramatically too. So if you have a test, you can respond to the changes in market conditions. Like I said, right now, the developers are telling us that even the subsidy we have is not enough to overcome the high cost of construction and the high interest rates. That wasn't the case before the pandemic. We had very low interest rates, very low construction costs. So my suspicion, again, is that we probably over-subsidized some of those apartment projects. We still ended up with a good result, that we had buildings and new units, but there could have been we could have had those projects work, and maybe there could have been a little bit more savings for the city. And the only way to get that is to put some kind of test in the legislation to make sure that we test it. And again, I think we have the expertise in-house with maybe a little bit of support from some of our vendors that we could do that analysis quickly. The pushback from the developers, and we talked about this, and naturally like, oh, you don't want to trust us. These projects need the full subsidy to go. And the pushback from them was like, they don't want to slow the project down to a point that we kind of over bureaucratize it, right? And slow it down that somebody says, I don't want to deal with it. But I think you can do it in a way that you have a short period of time where you say, we look at the financials, we analyze it, we figure out what the right subsidy is, and then we say, check, this one can go with the right subsidy amount to make the project happen. So I think we can sort that out among the group, and we've talked about that pretty extensively in our work group.
Regarding what the group has raised as a finding, and just a quick note, I do want to acknowledge our city administrator, Faith Leach, has joined us today. So going back to my question, for the brownfield tax credit that you spoke about earlier, what conversations have been had at the state level about how much we're putting in, how much we are contributing, if any at all?
We were able to gather the information from the state last year, so we did put a lot of research into this. The state actually has a report for the fund used to be called the Brownfield Reinvestment Fund. Now it's some kind of broader economic development fund. I can't remember the exact name, but they have reports that they provided to us to say how many grants or loans were made back to Baltimore City from the proceeds that were put into the fund. So we were able to track how much we contributed to the fund over many years, because again, the state requirement is that if we give a tax credit, we make a contribution. And we were able to pull out of the data how many loans or grants came back to Baltimore City. Not all those are loans back to just the city. They're often loans back to developers to do additional cleanup work on other properties. So we were able to run the numbers and see that it was pretty imbalanced, that we were, on average over time, it was about a little bit over $1 million a year on average of more contributions that we were putting in than we were getting out. Now, if you participate, the only way to participate in the program is to be in it and make the contribution. So you can't join the program and say, we're not going to contribute to the fund. But that's why the conversations internally around, maybe do we pull ourselves out of the fund or out of the program and make our own tax credit locally, or do we change some of these optional provisions that we had that actually makes it a little bit more expensive for the city? So this is a tough one, but we did talk to the state about it. We did gather the data. We do now have the confidence that we got the data right, because at first we looked at it, we're like, wait, are we really over contributing? And as we dug into it, it's like, yeah, we're actually spending a little bit more than we're pulling out of it.
Yeah, usually, people sometimes incorrectly tell us that we're not contributing enough, so to know that we're contributing more was a flag. We're going to move to Council Member Gray.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier, you talked about the possibility for adopting a tiered credit structure, much like some other municipalities. I think you named Columbus as well. Could you go a little more into that proposal, and then do you also think the Finance Department could support that type of framework that subsidizes the neighborhoods based on the three categories that you stated, which were the persistently disinvested, ready for revitalization, and market ready?
Yeah, so I think we have a tool already that could help us do that. Folks might be familiar with HED does what they call their market typology. So we have an analysis that's done. I think they do it every 4 or 5 years, where they run a bunch of data to try to figure out where is the housing market in different neighborhoods. Is it functioning, without much support? Is there high rates of vacancy? Is there high rates of, owner occupied properties? I mean, they kind of crunch all the data and put a map together. So that tool could be something that we could use to do that. I think we could, we would be able to support it, because if you do that, if you have that tiered system, you kind of have all the addresses in the map, and then when somebody goes to apply, it kind of automatically puts you into one or the other category. So I think we've seen that for other programs that have boundaries, like the enterprise zone, for example, there's a way for us to quickly check those boundaries. I think, the reason we've talked about that tiered approach is, again, we want to be able to gear the right subsidy to the right neighborhood. And I'm of the opinion of saying, like, for certain neighborhoods, we need to do a full 100% abatement plus probably additional investments. But for the neighborhoods that have done really well, my suspicion is that we could kind of ease the subsidy a little bit, still have something, but again, have some savings there that we'd be willing to take the chance on some of those other neighborhoods. And, a neighborhood that has a lot of vacants, for example, we're not generating much tax revenue from that neighborhood anyway. So if you say we're going to be very aggressive and have a very aggressive subsidy, 100% for 10 years, you're not getting much from that property as it is. And so I think you're willing to take a little bit more of a gamble on something like that and say, let's have a very aggressive subsidy to turn those neighborhoods around. Whereas, again, a more developed neighborhood, there's probably some natural developments that's going to happen anyway in the harbor east of the world in Federal Hills, for example. And maybe if you had a little bit less of a subsidy, some of that development would still happen there anyway.
Thank you for that answer. Because just looking just in my district alone, and the reason I bring this up is what you were talking about with CHAP and the 10-year abatement. Folks in Tin Hills and Hunting Ridge, they have a CHAP representative there every meeting, right? And they have these questions, and I think it's great. But equity-wise, I think we do have to look at that, to look at areas that also have that CHAP designation, that they aren't getting that TLC, because we know if you incentivize folks to do the right thing, they will do the right thing, because at the end of the day, money talks, and we can revitalize areas in a couple years just by changing that. So that's really good to hear. My second question is the homeowners, the homestead tax credit and the under enrollment. What ideas have you guys had? Because just as someone who used to be a community outreach coordinator, I just immediately think of AFRAM. I think of the Health Expo. I think of any opportunity where a council member or CP is having an event that we can make sure that someone's there and literally walk people through the process. I feel like outside of a capacity issue, this should be the easiest of lift for us as a city to tell people, hey, this is we're going to lessen your tax burden. And so I just wanted to know, what are you guys doing to close that gap, increased outreach, and, what help do you need from us as a council, as a body, to help you with that?
So there would be, thank you for that question. There would be, our plan is that in our 10-year financial plan, there will be initiative related to trying to boost the enrollment in the program. And my feeling is we'll probably have to spend some money to do that, and that's a good thing. What that could look like, I think, first of all, is that we think that we have enough data through available tools, through census data and CSA data and assessments, that we could probably target blocks where we're like, probably people on this block or in this neighborhood are likely to be signed up. From there, we could work with trusted partners in the council person that represents the district or other, community organizations in that district to help do the outreach. What we found is that process, signing up for the credit, is pretty complicated because the eligibility is based on your household income, so not just you, but your partner or spouse or others that live in the household. It's based on your net worth, which means you have to kind of dig up records. If you have like 401k or a pension fund, something, you have to produce that. And so it's not something that like people can be at like a festival and be like, hey, I want to sign up. It's not that easy because you have to have all the records with you. But what the nonprofit folks have told us that's most effective is they do it around tax time. So people that go to the places to get their federal taxes done, state taxes, they kind of bring a pile of like all their documents. There's setups there where they have people that say, hey, do you also want to, while you're here, try to sign up or see if you're eligible for the state homeowners tax credit? So that has worked. There's a provider in the community that does that service. But I do think, like a targeted door-to-door might be needed. And, we had a good conversation in one of the last work group meetings about, a lot of seniors are told kind of don't trust, be careful of scams, right? So you have to have trusted people. So that's why having council members do that would be helpful. Again, but I think we could get the data to target it and say, these are the blocks in your district that we really think there's probably some people there. We don't know for sure, but there's probably people on that block that would be eligible. Could we do a targeted program where the council person assists, or do we hire other folks to help go door to door? Again, we'd probably have to spend some money on that to do it. But I think there's a pathway where we could spend, $500,000 to $1 million and maybe enroll enough people that we're generating a lot more benefit back to the city.
Yeah, thanks for that, because as we know, as far as our share of, the funding from the state, we are fighting to get that. And so if we can find any way to help out our constituents, I think that's a great idea. Another idea just came to mind is the Office of Older Adults. I know Ms. Harmon is doing a great job. She has an event coming up in Mount Pleasant. Just when those types of events happen, to ensure like we're putting the word out, by the way, if you want to sign up for your homestead tax credit, just bring these things and someone will be there to work with you. I know that for folks, finding that information is hard, but to be able to, take advantage of those savings could be the difference between someone keeping their house or not. So I do appreciate you guys taking that in consideration.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that one, some things can be done immediately. Just like the one suggestion that Councilman Gray has provided. I did have a similar question, and you did answer that question, that there is an initiative. But right now, are they ideas, or is there anything that's concrete?
And there are ideas at this point.
Okay.
Our idea would be that for, when we go live with a 10-year plan, anything that's initiative will have a team that's working on it to implement. So a team like for this initiative, it would include representatives from some of our, nonprofit providers that have expertise in the area. It would include city agency heads, from the health department or community action centers, people that are working with folks on a day-to-day basis that can help give us insight. There would be, like I said, some data analysis where kind of our folks or city staff folks or those type of folks can kind of crunch the numbers and say, here's where we think there are people that are eligible. So there would be a team approach where we'd have, for every one of those initiatives, we have a team working on that to kind of implement it. So I can't say that there's anything directly we're doing yet, but the idea would be for each of the initiatives, we kind of have a small team that's working to implement it. And, we're starting to put some thought into what would those teams look like, who would the representatives need to be on each of those teams. You want to keep them kind of small enough that they're nimble, but like enough expertise that people, know what to do. I mean, when I presented this to the cabinet a couple months ago, Dr. Brooks came right up to me, he's like, oh yeah, we got to do this, and here's all the, so there's people out there that are already dealing with these issues and have a lot of ideas about what needs to be done. It's a matter of us as a city kind of putting those heads together and kind of focusing on these key initiatives that will, generate a lot of benefit for our homeowners.
Yep. Madam Chair, I'd like to be recognized. So to Councilmember Gray's specific recommendation.
City Administrator,
I'm sorry.
Can you
I
just
didn't
give
allow you to
your
recognize
name
me.
and your title?
Faith Leach, Chief Administrative Officer. To Councilmember Gray's recommendation, and Councilwoman Ramos, who's been an active member of the working group, knows this very well. We've actually received a proposal from a group that's already doing this work related to tax sale, and they wanted to be able to offer some additional door-to-door support around enrollment in the program. So there's active conversations, I would say, about ways that we can begin to do some of this work and actually help fill the gap on what we know is a real need in the community.
Thank you. Can you just let us know the timeline again for the 10-year plan that's going to be coming out?
So thank you so much for that question. So we have, the 10-year plan is drafted and we're out now doing stakeholder engagement. So we're engaging with members of this body. We're engaging with our state elected officials. We're also doing community engagement because that's gonna be really key, is to hear directly from our residents about what their needs are, what their expectations are. And we want our residents to be able to see themselves in our plan. The idea is to take that feedback, incorporate it into the 10-year plan, and over the summer, early fall, we would do a full release of the plan.
Okay, so late summer, early fall. Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Council President or Council Member Gray, did you have any additional questions? Okay, we did put out sign-in sheets for public testimony, but at this time in chambers, we do not have anyone signed up to testify. We are going to take just a minute to double, and that means that we're going to close that portion. Just want to note that we don't have anyone presently to testify. At this time, we are going to place this hearing in recess. Again, we thank you for your presentation and your time today, as well as your team.